Hi everyone, so this is episode 19 of Roxy's Journal of Stitchery and this is part 1. I'm going to have 2 parts tonight. This first one is showing you how I finish off my bunny block, and then my second part is showing you how I attach my blocks to my pages. So I just wanted to show you, I got a wonderful gift from a lady called Laurie, and I will link her Etsy store below. She's making slow stitch kits, and she sent me a sample and also sent Rachel a sample for us just to have a go and give her some feedback on what she's got in them. So in the kit, I got these beautiful little flowers, these little embroidered flowers, and I've decided that I'm going to use some of them in my grass or field at the bottom because I think it needs some colour. So I'm just playing around and working out which ones I think will work. So I do have a look at this big one, which is really beautiful, but it's a little bit big and it's covering up too much of the lace, so I don't use that one. What I end up going with is the orange and yellow. That one there is my favorite. I love that one. That's gorgeous. So I'm happy with that one just there under the bunny's foot. And then I am going to use the red and pink ones as well. I'm just working out where I'd like them to go. Playing around, seeing where I think it looks good, and then I do end up using another one of the orange ones. So I end up putting it over on that side. I do add in these sort of tan and brown ones as well. I like them, but I decided not to put them in because I don't want to cover up too much of the lace, because I have some other things I want to put on the green part as well. Now that I've decided which ones I'm going to use and about the sort of place where I'm going to put them, I'm starting to stitch them on. So I'm using my thin silk thread just because it's fairly invisible, and I'm just doing like an overcast stitch, so just little stitches going through the flower and then over a part of it and back through the fabric to hold it in place. So you'll see that I do that with the first one, and then I will cut towards the end where I've stitched them all down using the same technique. So just finding places, like on this orange one, I think I actually go through each of the petals, maybe except 1 or 2, just to stitch them in place. So I'm just speeding myself up now on the video just to make it go a bit quicker, because I think you get the idea and I don't want my video to be too long. So my 2 orange flowers are now stitched in place, and I'm moving on to the red and the pink ones. Same technique, just doing little overcast stitches, little straight stitches, capturing part of the little flower embroidery and then taking it back through the base of my block so that it's held in place securely. Right, cutting forward, and all my little flowers have been stitched in place. Now what I want to do is I actually want to add a little bit of bling, and I'm going to add some sequins. I really like sequins. I have quite a few different types. I particularly like buying them from my crafty op shop, where you can get like fairly decent sized bags for like 50 cents, 40 cents, things like that. So I've got some sequins here. These ones I actually did buy new from a place called Sequin Bazaar. It's an online store in Australia. And I particularly like the little small sequins, and that's what these ones are. So in this little bag I got here, I've got a mix of greens and sort of purpley greens. So I'm going to show you 2 different ways that I tend to stitch down my sequins. So the first way is just to stitch it down with thread. So I've come up through the fabric and through the middle of the sequin, and then I go over the sequin's edge and back down through the fabric. Then I actually start off coming up through the middle each time, and what I want to do is I want to do 3 stitches in total, but very shortly I will switch, and once I've made my first stitch I then start coming up from the outside and back down through the middle, just because it's easier. Otherwise you're having to try and find that little center hole with your needle from behind, and it's a little bit difficult. So you'll see in a minute I do actually switch the technique. So the first one comes up through the middle of the sequin and down through the fabric, and then the second stitch I come up on the outside of the sequin and then down through the middle, and the third stitch up through the outside of the sequin and then down through the middle of the sequin. So I create 3 stitches, kind of like dividing the circle into thirds, and then that way it's held down nice and securely. So I am showing you up close, but I know that it is difficult to see. The type of thread that I used on this first sequin was just that silk thread that I've got. So the thread it's not that noticeable, which is the look I was going for. So I've stitched a few sequins on now, and I'm going to skip forward a little bit further, and I've got quite a little cluster there of them. If you can just see them, they're sparkling in the light. Now I'm going to move on to my second technique for stitching down sequins, so I need beads, and I've got these sweet little green beads, and I've got some sort of darker colour green sequins as well. Again, both the beads and the sequins have come from my Crafty Op shop. So I'm going to show you. So down in this corner, I come up through the fabric where I want my sequin to be, pop my sequin on, and just a note, I'm actually using a beading needle, which is very, very fine, and they can be difficult to thread, but I need to use it with these seed beads because they're very tiny, otherwise my needle won't go through. So I thread a bead onto my needle, and then I take my needle back down through my sequin, and the bead is what holds the sequin in place. The sequin won't come up because the bead is covering the center and holding it in place. The thread I'm using is the same thread again. It is just the silk thread. It is not very noticeable at all, and that was my intention. Okay, so back down through the center of the sequin, I've got my bead there, and it holds it in place. So what I do with these sequins is I do a little cluster. I try to do odd numbers. I've just counted it. I've got 12. So I broke my rule. It's not odd numbers. Most of the time I do odd numbers though. So I'm going to skip forward again because you don't need to watch me stitch down 12 sequins. Alright, so now I'm going to do a third lot of sequins. These ones again green, they're very pale and fairly invisible. And what I want to do is I want to use one of my metallic threads. I've got a nice little container here of metallic threads. And I'm going to use the metallic thread to stitch down the sequin. Same technique as the first lot of sequins I was stitching down, but instead of 3 stitches, this time I'm going to do 5. Now, these metallic threads are challenging to use. They do fray, they come apart, they're difficult to thread in your needle. So I'm doing this technique where I fold the thread in half and then I thread it through, and it's much easier than trying to thread the ends that have become split and coming apart. That's very difficult to thread these into a fine needle. So my very pale green sequins coming up through the middle and over the edge to create a stitch, but this time I'm doing 5 stitches, not 3. So there's the first one, and then coming up, here's my explanation from before, coming up through the outside and back through the middle is easier because I don't have to find that center hole. So just speeding up the video now, doing those 5 stitches to hold that sequin in place. And this time I do a little cluster around the outside of that orange and yellow flower. I do 3 down the bottom and I end up doing 5 at the top. So I've stuck to my odd number rule this time. So just to show you a close-up I know it's hard to see that thread. In real life, you can actually see the little orange thread on top of the green sequin. So all my sequins are done. I'm not doing any more beading on this one. All that I'm doing now is I'm adding some embroidery to my green part. So I'm doing bullion knots here in between the 4 petals of this green lace. So I'm using the 6 strands of the stranded cotton, and I wrap my needle 5 times. Now I'm using a milliner's needle. They're the straight ones where it doesn't get wider for the eye of the needle, and they are what we use when we do wrap stitches like the French knots, like the bullion stitch, like the colonial knots, things like that. They're much easier to use. I mean, you can do it with a chenille needle, but it becomes more challenging. And for the people struggling with bullion knots, I know some of you are not liking them or finding them difficult. I would encourage you to get that milliner's needle and persist in practicing, because it's a wonderful stitch. It's actually one of my favorites, and I know it's one of my sister's favorites, and we use it all the time. It's really interesting because it gives some good dimension to your embroidery. I love doing them. Mine aren't always neat. That first one I did wasn't so neat. The next 3 were a bit better. Okay, so don't worry if they're not perfect. The more you do them, the better you'll get. And if they're a little bit messy, it doesn't matter. My 4 bullion knots are done, and now what I'm going to do is a little French knot in the middle of that flower. So using the 6 strands of cotton again, I make my French knot. I think I wrapped it twice, and then I go down through that hole again to make the French knot. Sorry, you can't see it too well. I'll come back up on screen. So there's my French knot. And then what I do is I do some little French knots around the outer petals as well. So I start off thinking I'm going to do 3, and I end up doing 6 just because it fills in that space nicely. So I do start with 3, and then I come back and I add 3 more. All right, so the French knots are coming along. I'm almost done on these. I've filled in those little petals. Now I don't want to go too crazy filling it all in with colour, because it'll take away from the nice green lace that I've dyed, and I want that to be quite prominent. So I only do a little bit of embellishing. I will do a little bit of stitching in the centre of some of the other lace flowers as well. But I'm not going to show you that. It's just some little straight stitches, like satin stitches pretty much, just filling in the center with some color. Alright, the embroidery is all done. I'm just deciding if I want to do any more, but I think I'm happy with that. So I'm playing around with adding some buttons. I always like to add some buttons to my pieces. So I've got these 3 beautiful, very pale aqua shell buttons. And I'm just seeing where they'd look best, whether I'll put them at the top or the bottom. And I decide that the bottom is where I want them to go. So I want to use a contrasting thread. I've got my neon pink Appleton wool. I've doubled it over so it's double thickness, and with each button I do 2 stitches just to make sure that you can see the colour really well. If I did 1, it wouldn't stand out as much, so I do 2, and it also secures that button further. So with the sequins done, the little bit of embroidery and 3 buttons added, I'm happy with how the base of my block is looking. And finally, a couple of photos just to hopefully give you a bit of a closer view of the things that I've done in today's video. So I will be uploading a second video, part 2, about 15 minutes after this one starts. And in that video, what you'll see is how I attach my first blocks, my 2 sampler blocks, and my block number 1, the bunny block, to my first book page. So I'm going to go through and show you how I do that. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and you get something out of it, and I will see you in part 2. Thanks for watching. Bye.